Testing. We're loud and clear. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to Trajectory Labs, and welcome to our inaugural Weird AI Wednesday series. So we're hoping to do this once a month going forward. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. If it's your first time here at Trajectory Labs, can you raise your hand, please? Cool. This is a lot of new people. Did you guys, who found out about us through the Hinton lectures? Okay. Where did everybody else find out about us? Just yell. Luma. Okay, just all right. Maybe they promote us. Awesome. Well, anyways, thrilled to have you with us. If you do need to use the washrooms, just outside the glass doors. Also, the way we do things here is a bit different. We don't allow questions during the presentation. So if you have a question, instead of throwing your hand up, you can submit it on Slido. So if you look, there are some orange posters on the walls. If you scan the QR code, it'll take you to just a simple URL. You don't need to sign into an account or anything, but you can submit questions there, and then yeah, we'll be monitoring them. So if there's a quick clarification, I may interrupt Jason just to have him clarify something. If not, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the talk, where we'll sit down and kind of go through all the best questions. So yeah, I would encourage everybody to feel free to submit questions there, and please do vote on other people's questions. That helps us select the best ones. Yeah, without further ado, I'm really thrilled to have Jason Young here to present to us on what we can learn from the Luddites. So a big round of applause for Jason.
Thank you. Hello, so I am Jason Young. I'm a geopolitical analyst focused on frontier AI. And today my talk is on the Luddites. First of all, who doesn't know about the Luddites? Who has not heard the term Luddite before? Okay, interesting. You know, before this talk, I didn't know that much about them either. So if we just do a quick Google. Oh, where's the clicker? Oh, here it is. Sorry, give me a second here. The clicking. There you go. Okay. Oh. How do I? Okay, excellent. So if you search on Google, you'll see that the first term that comes up, definition, is a person opposed to new technology or ways of working. And this is how I know the term Luddite. It's more of like a pejorative term. You know, it's kind of describing someone who's like ignorant and against progress, and it's kind of like reactionary. The second definition is a little more accurate. It's historical. It says a member of any of the bands of English workers who destroyed machinery, especially in cotton and woolen mills, that they believe were threatening their jobs from 1811 to 1816. Actually, the dates are wrong. The Luddite Rebellion was from 1811 to 1813. Oop. Okay. So this is kind of the image you get of the Luddites in popular imagination. They're more associated with like ignorant, unproductive violence. It evokes the idea of like a rabble, like an ignorant mob. Like the idea of like stubbornness and like stupidity. But in reality, or at least how they saw themselves, Luddites were more like this. They saw themselves more as like and I think the historical fact bears out, they're more like a merry band of rebels faced with no other option other than to rebel against a tyrannical authority who were abusing the population. Even the very area that Luddites come from is kind of the area of the ancient Sherwood Forest where the legend of Robin Hood originates. Actually, back in the Luddite time, this is like the early 1800s, like poetry is much more important in that society. A lot of the poetry from that area, from that time about the Luddites, like evokes Robin Hood. So they actually come from that tradition. So I think the rebellion you can really see as part of the inheritance of this. So in their case, though, in their time, the tyrants were the owners of factories who had to put them out of work and ended a harmonious way of life by introducing industrial, steam-powered weaving machines that completely eliminated jobs, drove down wages, and wiped out the livelihoods of many families. As one Luddite described the effect of automation and poverty on their lives, quote, our homes, which were not too many years ago the abodes of comfort, have now become the dwelling places of misery and receptacles of wretchedness. So the book this talk is mostly drawn from this book called Rebels Against the Future by Kirkpatrick Sale, written in 1996. Funny thing about this book, there's actually a more recent book about the Luddites that I didn't read. This one was recommended as one of the most historically authoritative ones. But even back in 96, they were drawing parallels to like the technology at the time and inventing the internet. So it's interesting. Oh shit. Okay, so we're gonna go over the Luddite revolt. The revolt itself was actually not that long. It was like almost like a 15-month period between 1811 and 1813. The geopolitical context, we're gonna go over this in a little more detail. The geopolitical context was it was in England, and England was at war with France at the time. It was the early industrial revolution was the technological context, and the societal context was that it was still a monarchy in England. However, this is most of the countries in Europe were a monarchy except for France, which is why they were all at war with France. But this was post-French Revolution, post-American Revolution, and England had a colonial empire at this point, but not fully expanded. So let's delve into the geopolitical context of the revolt. At the time of the Luddite revolt, Britain had been at war with France pretty much since the French Revolution, which was 1789. Now Britain was not alone, because most of the European monarchies were at war with Republican France, because their very existence of this like Republican state that was not monarchist challenged the legitimacy of monarchy. However, Britain was one of the most active warring parties since it was right next to France, and they've been historical enemies since the medieval times. But at the start of the Luddite revolt, Britain had been at war with France for 18 years. This means that in Britain, there's been like a military culture, because like there's been a massive amount of men with military experience who had come home after their tour of duty, and they experienced that they could use directly, or they could train others with. The fact that it happened during this war is also like the war put a huge burden on the state to field so many people into the battlefield, and the British Empire also had colonies to supply. So this led to like food shortages and increased taxation. And lastly, the war also stimulated demand for things like uniforms, blankets, and stuff that required the textile industry to really increase their output. A part of why the automation rollout isn't. Now, the technological context of the Luddite revolts, it actually happened relatively far after the invention of the key instruments of the Industrial Revolution. So the spinning jenny, which is like a spinner machine. So there's two, as long as I understand, there's two machines. There's like spinner yarn and spin it into thread, and then there's like the looms, which actually takes thread and spin cloth into it. So there's like two different machines. But this was like seen as a major invention. It was invented in 1764, like 50 years before the Luddite Rebellion. And a couple of years later, in 1769, the first truly efficient steam engine was invented, the Watt steam engine. This was like the power horse that powered the entire Industrial Revolution. So like most inventions back then, it took a little while, and it took several decades, but eventually you had the spinning machines combined with the steam engines to create automatic steam-powered like weaving machines and spinning machines. So in the 20 years leading up to the revolt, which was 1811, the textile region saw like a gradual opening of more and more factories with machines and less demand for traditional hand weaving. And typically before, they used to work more autonomously, like more like a cottage industry, smaller workshops. They had a lot, like it was very different. Some stats I read that automation improved output from somewhere from like 100 times to like 1,000 times. Like the output increase was incredible. But however, reading all these facts doesn't just summarizing like this doesn't give a flavor of what actually happened. So I'm going to read you a quote from the book. Quote: "There had been a fashion among academics to minimize the revolutionary nature of British industrialization and to argue that the process was gradual and cumulative and uneven, with no dramatic upheavals. This is nonsense. Like any revolution, the causes go way back and the effects go way forward. Of course, it did not touch all regions or industries equally or simultaneously, and it was, of course, accompanied by changes to agriculture, marketing, and finance. But the fact is, it was a vast alteration of the nature of British society, so successful that it would impose itself, its own civilization, on Europe and the world before another century was over. It changed not just the face of manufacturing, but the places and purposes of production, the composition of the workforce, the character of the market, the pattern and sizes of settlements, and the role of families and communities. It happened rapidly, almost within a modest lifetime. If we take the dates 1785 to 1830, from the first successful steam-powered factory inaugurating the age to the first intercity railway inaugurating another age, during which the number of people in manufacturing exceeded that of agriculture for the first time in British history. The changes in British society between 1785 and 1830 were greater than any 45-year period before or since. So just a massive change, massive change to the society. Another quote about how they felt about the automation, what the automation really meant for them, the Luddites, or the people in the textile industry. Quote, "What loomed before them was not merely the factory, but the whole factory system as it was taking shape, with its long hours and incessant work and harsh supervision that reduced self-respecting artisans with long history of autonomy and status to dependent wage slaves. What loomed, in fact, was a world in which the machine seemed to be the principal agent of change, overturning what seemed to be the customary and proper modes of life and work, erasing old bonds of both household and marketplace, eroding ancient tenets of honest wages, good goods, and just prices, in substituting instead relations built upon power and capital, and a morality guided by no aim higher than profit." One more quote here. "Under the old system, custom protected the worker's right and the worker's dignity. It was an impartial arbiter in disputes, the guardian of community morality. But the factory would steamroll custom, turn its workers into slaves under a immoral regime dictated by the factory master's profits. The factory would undermine all these values upon which the workers' cultures and communities were predicated, replacing them with new immoral imperatives of the market economy. What was at risk was not just the workers' jobs, it was the very fabric of existing social organization." So on the Luddites themselves, now these were people employed by the textile industry. These were like knitters, weavers, shearers. Like shearers are like people that kind of shear the lambs for the wool and then kind of scrape off all the parts that make them clean. Where do they get the name Luddites? The Luddites were named after Ned Ludd, which is kind of like a mythical figure. In a way, he was kind of like the meme of their time. Like he started off as like a joke or legend. They also called him General Ludd or King Ludd. But historians agreed that it was a pseudonym and there was no evidence that he actually existed. There is an explanation in the Nottingham Review in 1811 that explained, once upon a time there was a boy named Ned Ludd who had been apprenticed to a knitter near Leicester. But he was so reluctant to work that his master got the magistrate to order him whipped. Whereupon the lad took a hammer and demolished his knitting frame, an act that gained such renown that when any machine was damaged, people would say Ned Ludd had been there. So I guess this thing was kind of memed into existence. With regard about how they operated, here's what we know about like their conduct in terms of their destruction of machines and the organized violence against factories. They were known to operate in the style of like a military group. They used weapons to force entry into factories and destroy machines. They used like They used like different signals and were highly coordinated. Oath taking was big in the organization. This had the hallmarks of like a military or paramilitary organization. They generally operated at night and were young men in their early 20s. They also benefited from like community support and silence. So in many ways, like this, reading about this, they resemble like a classic guerrilla warfare force, kind of like the Viet Cong in Vietnam or the Taliban in Afghanistan. And last thing to say is that The Luddites actually had no real overarching political goals other than to draw attention to how textile workers were treated by factory owners. But at the end of the day, there was a hope. They had a hope that the government, in hearing their plight, would do something about it. Kirkpatrick writes that Luddism was not really revolutionary in the conventional sense of the like having armies in the street and like a government in waiting to be put into power. Luddism's revolt at bottom was not against the government or king, like previous revolts, like the Guy Fawkes revolt. It was more a revolt against the entire system of industrialism and dislocation and the dislocations it entailed and its values. So, in terms of the sequence of events, it's kind of interesting because in terms of it has an outsized impact on the popular consciousness, considering how short it was and considering like how, compared to modern revolutions, very few people actually lost their lives. The main action of the revolt was only about 7 months, from November 1811 to May 1812. So basically, after threatening letters started to be circulating around 1811, there was like a lot of tensions, food shortages, wage drops. There was a lot of suffering in the population. The first large-scale attacks on factories with all these weaving machines began in November 1811, resulting in destruction of many machines and the burning of factories. Once it starts, it really picks up. The turning point comes in April 1812 when a factory owner puts up like true resistance to the Luddites. He has his own employees and he hires a bunch of militia people to defend his factory, and they end up killing 4 Luddites. And this is when blood is first spilt. And after that, because before this, both sides were pretty careful to try to stop the other, but to not kill anyone. And after blood is spilt, you can't really go back from that. After this, troops are sent by the central government to kind of stop the situation. And they try to make arrests, but they're like faced with just a wall of silence from the community. No one is going to say anything. And every time they seem to be always late. The Luddites seem to always be one step ahead. This is like the classic insurgency, like a big lumbering army, like dealing with a small band of rebels. But after blood is spilt, the conflict enters a vicious spiral, and the Luddites end up murdering a factory owner, and then the government begins a real crackdown. In like spring 1812, the government deploys like 14,400 soldiers to the region, which is so much. It's the greatest internal military deployment in the British history up to that point. And they say that in May 1812, basically, if you're in that region, 1 in every 70 people in that region would be a deployed soldier. In comparison, 4 years earlier, when the British were fighting the French in Portugal, they had sent like 8,700 soldiers as part of like their contribution to like the Allied force. And remember, Britain has all these colonies it has to oversee too, so it was no small like expenditure and cost. So the Luddite revolt actually happened amidst like general food shortages and overall discontent for different issues unrelated to like the textile workers. And during completely non-Luddite related riots in like main cities related to food prices, the rioters would start identifying with the Luddites, so that like Luddism became associated with anti-government sentiment and eventually with the concept of like revolution itself, even if the Luddites did not want to overthrow the government. It gets really crazy, actually. The climax of this period is that someone actually walks up to the prime minister in front of parliament and shoots him in like a Luigi Mangione style. The assassin had nothing to do with the Luddites, but this kind of made the government snap. And after this, excessive force was used to put down the Luddite rebellion. Like before this, arrested Luddites would be given more lenient sentences, which back in those days meant being deported to Australia. But after the crackdown, they started to like execute prisoners and on like kind of trumped up charges or like on like less favorable evidence, I guess. The biggest one was in January 1813, when 14 Luddites were hung in a very public execution. So the collapse of the movement happened shortly after 1813. On the collapse of the movement, I quote the book, Luddism at its core was a heterogeneous howl of protest and defiance. But once that cry was heard in the land, and the only response of officialdom and the merchantry was indifference, indignation, and inhibition, it hardly knew what to do, how to continue, where to move. And at that juncture, only a few in its ranks were persuaded of the need to arm and murder and march in a general rising. In a sense, Luddism ended because in 15 months because it had made its point. So overall, like after the government took really stern measures, and it seemed like they were determined not to do anything, like accede to any of their demands, which is like their only demand was to stop these machines from coming here. When the government was not prepared to do anything like that, then a lot of them just gave up. They didn't go to the level of revolution after that. While the events of the revolt weren't that long, the impact was long-lasting because of its place in history. This was a time when capitalism was in its infancy, and there was, for the first time, an alignment. This was the occasion for an alignment between business owners and aristocrats. And for the first time, this alignment created like the modern conception of class that we kind of inherit today. To quote the book, among the important effects of Luddism, the most lasting, perhaps, were the lessons absorbed, the strategies that were learned by the sectors of British society that were the victors of this war. Chief among them was the alliance forged between the British government and British industrial enterprise. Not that the British establishment had been hostile to industrialists, but now it had been proven willing to support their cause with its powers of force and repression, not just in the name of order, but in the name of their kind of order, the new industrial order. It was acknowledging for the first time in history an identity of interests that would become the dominant theme of that nation's 19th century experience. A crucial instrument of this alliance would wield devastating effect was being forged around this time. The creation of the idea of class, i.e. a ruling upper class and a working lower class. I don't mean that the making of this was the making of the working class, but rather the making of the idea of it. It was not any true class consciousness, since which is really nowhere to be found in this period, but rather a class concept, which is a very useful construct for social manipulation and stratification. Once an idea like class can be established to explain how society operates, it becomes a way of seeing the proper, or at least ordained, segmentation of the populace, the division between rich and poor, as an eternal and acceptable given in Britain, like bad weather and abundant coal. So just to put it in different words, essentially, this created the modern, this reshaped society into the class structure that we still inherit today. Yeah. Let's see. As such, then, it is a useful tool for those in power, relegating some populations to labor and poverty as if it were God's will, and then serving to create and strengthen those institutions through unions, schools, societies, churches that would keep them there, adjusted to the industrial system around it and its fundamental values. Another quote on its impact on relations between business owner and worker. For the industrialists, Luddism's other effect was to have opened a permanent breach between worker and master, who had traditionally had certain bonds and obligations that drew them together despite their differing standings. The obdurancy of mill owners, I think that's like just negative conflict. The negative conflict between the mill owners and the workers, escalating to include murder on both sides. And lastly, the Luddite revolts was also the direct precursor to trade unions. Before this revolt, collective bargaining was completely illegal, so workers had no legal outlets except sabotage. After, many early union strongholds were former Luddite districts. While the revolt had failed, it showed the elite that unregulated capitalism was dangerous. After all, it took 14,000 soldiers to put down the revolt, and resulted in a severe political crisis in the kingdom. This pushed society, very slowly, towards legal forms of worker organization. Actually, I read when you saw the fading of the kind of sabotage, like guerrilla movements of the Luddites in 1813, um, there started to be an increased political activism within the system, and there was an increased petitioning of like their needs within the system. So it kind of worked out like that. As for the cultural impact, this actually gets pretty interesting. Now, if you go back and watch Lord of the Rings, there are clear themes of technology and industrialization and the destruction of the natural world being aligned with Sauron and evil, versus the Shire, where life is natural and unchanged, and everything good associated with that. It's a real humanism that reaches all the way back to the time of the Luddites and the Romantic movement of literature. Reading another quote from the book. Another expression of the Ludditic kind was Romanticism, beginning with Blake and Wordsworth and Byron. These are all English poets, who, like the machine breakers, were repulsed by the satanic mills and the getting and spending of the present, and were mindful of the ruined paradise of the past. This Romanticism, particularly its attachment to unspoiled, machine-free nature, was echoed across the Atlantic by American poets Hawthorne, Poe, Melville, Emerson, Thoreau, great American poets. The Luddite time also influenced Charles Dickens, who wrote his famous books about the times that the Luddites occurred. The Tale of Two Cities, Hard Times. But overall, the cultural impact of the Luddite revolt was that it was the first organized confrontation between modern technology and society. So one more quote for the book. The one last great consequence of Luddism, and the one that traditional historians have tried to ignore, was that it raised what was called as the 19th century machinery question. Who would determine what would be the technology of production for Britain? By what criteria would they decide? How would the consequence of this be judged? The answers of the innovators, owners of capital and production, is that the improvement of machinery is beneficial instead of being detrimental to the interests of the laboring manufacturer and to the community at large. The question was answered by an equation which equated improved machinery to decreased cost, which meant increased profit in production, which meant continued employment for those not done out of work, resulting in happiness. But the simple overarching fact is that technology always has consequences, far-reaching consequences, usually that go far beyond what anyone could predict at the beginning. And this truth is what lies at the heart of Luddism, and the reason why the name and idea lasted beyond its brief 15-month course. So what is, like, after hearing all this, what does this tell us about possible societal adaptation to AI? So if we're looking at the conditions that led to the Luddite revolt, there was a war, there was a widespread economic displacement, and then there was easy targets for retribution. Now, I don't think war is actually necessary, but war is interesting because it's like an additional stressor. Like, a lot of times insurgencies occur during times of war. And it's not necessary, but like, I guess what is necessary is like conditions of external and internal stress. In terms of easy targets for retribution now, I suppose like data centers, robots. I mean, if you, even like the AI engineer Devin, like, you know, he's gotten a lot of instances of hate. I don't think we're anywhere here, but like, you know, basically we're looking for conditions of revolt. It's stuff like this. But overall, like, I think revolt also requires like some kind of collective identity, like shared grievances, shared identity, shared enemy, shared goals. And we're not there yet. So once the revolt has occurred, what does the Luddite lesson teach us? Well, it teaches us first that there's first violence against materials, and then it's a slippery slope into violence against people. And once it's people-on-people violence and blood isn't spilled, it's a ratcheting up, and it's a vicious cycle that increases radicalization, and the whole thing kind of just changes. Typically at this point, it becomes a national crisis that splits the political system, people that are sympathetic, people that are against. And then this kind of moves into more of a classic insurgency, counterinsurgency dynamic, which is not specific to technology or the Luddites. And there's also a link between insurgency and and like an external war, or there's times that it doesn't happen too. But if there's an external war, it just stresses like the state that's trying to manage it because they have to deal with an external enemy and an internal enemy. Classically, I think a lot of insurgencies occur during wartime. Okay, and after the revolts, what can we expect? Well, after the first confrontation between society and AI, in whatever form it will take, because it is the first in this, the first conflict always sets the rules for the coming age, and like the Luddites, kind of set the rules for industrialization and like the labor laws we have today, trade unions. Like we benefit from the stuff that they started today. I'm sure that the first confrontation with AI, whatever form it reaches, the widespread one, whatever it reaches, will set the terms for that system, whatever that system is in the future. Hopefully, the violence and turmoil will lead to some kind of new equilibrium, regardless if the movement is successful or it's not. The Luddites actually were extremely unsuccessful. They didn't achieve really any of their goals in the short term, and when the times the Luddites were alive, I think they just faced widespread impoverishment, and like it wasn't a sad story for them, but like it was in the generations later that change actually happened. And the final thing is new political and cultural ideas are born in such times. So whatever, the communism, capitalism, left and right, these debates that we inherit today are very much the product of the 20th century. And those were the product of the century before. So this is very much our inheritance comes from this. But in the future, in this century, what new political ideologies, what new solutions will come? I'm not really sure. So, yeah. So what are the differences in the Luddite example and any future example of societal response to AI? Well, I think a big difference is like the scale. They were like they were in the English heartland, which is a large area, but compared to the scale of AI, it's relatively small, concentrated, like rural. AI is going to impact a predominantly urban, globalized context, so that's very different. The Luddites didn't have much. Well, I mean, first of all, they weren't political theorists. They were just like guys working in like the weaving shop, and they drew upon like limited political history, limited like thought. We have like the entire internet at our disposal, and plus the entire history of the 19th and 20th centuries to draw upon to bring to this. So it's completely different references and knowledge spaces to draw upon and thinking. And of course, the sewing machines were never going to turn us all into like yarn or something like that. So the existential risk element of AI is a real difference than what the Luddites were facing. That being said, I would say that in terms of like a worker being displaced and the poverty and like the worries about that, how to provide for your family, I think that's very much will be the same. So what are the similarities in the Luddite example versus and our possible societal adaptation to AI? I guess the key similarity is that they were both centered around a revolution of technology that was necessary for geopolitical success. The Industrial Revolution was key to the Great Britain's, kind of maintaining top status in the colonial wars. And you see a lot of that with AI now. So I would say that it inhabits the right place. I would say that to go even further, I would say like now we're seeing a time when frontier AI companies and tech companies are almost behaving like their own geopolitical actors, given their power and influence and their importance to the state. This is only similar to times around colonial times when, like, for instance, the East India Company was its own like arm of government, basically a geopolitical actor. So like there's similarities to that too. Oh yeah, so with that, I mean, I don't think in terms of like bringing the Luddite example to our time, I don't think we're quite there yet. But I just assembled a bunch of like news stories just to see where we're at in terms of this timeline here. So I don't know if you remember Andrew Yang. He was the 2020 Democratic candidate. He was the first guy to talk about UBI in the States. And, one of his key examples was if automated truck driving puts all these truckers out of work. A lot of these truckers have military experience, and they're not going to like being taken out of livelihoods. And there's going to be violence and chaos. I remember he mentioned this on a number of podcasts. I mean, that hasn't happened so far, but from what I've heard, but there's still the potential for that to happen. And you've been following the news. You've been seeing the data center backlash for AGI. There's going to be more data centers built. More, there's been a lot of articles about that they need fresh water, not salt water, and it's going to affect drinking water supplies, and it's going to bring up it's going to affect your access to electricity. So just there is a backlash to data centers that are growing. This is kind of evidence of discontent. And then we have the Hollywood writer's strike over generative AI, which I think they won, but I don't know what the status of that is with Sora coming out now, Sora 2 especially. So definitely not a fight that's over yet, but we're already seeing pitched battles between I don't think they'd be able to do it without being part of a writers guild or a union. So we're starting to see organized labor confront AI in this way already. And we've started to seeing limited instances of autonomous vehicles, robots getting destroyed. This one is a Waymo car being destroyed in San Francisco. But these incidents are still super isolated. And of course, you've been seeing the news and Amazon wanting to replace 500,000 workers with robots. So, and we are just at the cusp of the large-scale introduction of robots into our workforce. So, they might be like the weaving machines back in the day. So we'll see how this works out. And of course, in terms of public protests, I haven't seen too many public protests against AI. This happened 2 months ago, but I think this guy is from Stop AI, which is an organization, and he did this in front of DeepMind in London. And there was someone who also protested in front of Anthropic in San Francisco. They did have a hunger strike. I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but protest still in its early days. Maybe another way to look at this, this is not AI related, but the way the taxi drivers reacted to Uber by violently attacking Ubers for a little while. But this was a sustained protest and kind of violence against Ubers, but ultimately it failed. So yeah, that's pretty much it. On that note, I'm ending my talk, and I should have thought better conclusion points, but overall, yeah, I think the Luddite example is really interesting, and it's really interesting, really seeing the connections from history, where it came from, and how it kind of descended, and how it kind of touches our time, and how it influences our own debate, and more than anything, the Luddites were an inflection point in history, which is kind of why we remember them to this day. However, we do remember them as ignorant, machine breaking, anti-progress people. But the reality is very different. And in the future, I wonder how our machine resistance future, or our relation to the machines and all that stuff will be written. Anyway, thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Jason. We're going to do Q&A in about 3 or 4 minutes, so feel free to submit some questions, vote on your top questions, or have a quick bathroom break if you need it.
Oh, thanks. Hello.
Testing 1, 2. You guys are a very quiet, attentive crowd. That's great. It varies a lot. Sometimes we'll get people in who are just, sometimes it's very hard to get people to stop talking, and sometimes
They're all scared.
yeah,
They're all
that's
scared
right.
from the Luddites.
They understand the consequences if, I don't know, I might ask you to be quiet. That's about the big consequence. Are we good to go, Georgia? Okay, and we're good to go. Thanks so much for the talk. Awesome stuff, and a big thanks to everybody who submitted and voted on questions. So to start with, what was your perception of the Luddites like before you started this research? Were you pretty sympathetic or critical of them? And did your kind of research into the backstory change that much?
I had no idea about their story before this. I just thought they were like an anti-technology group that like operated in the Industrial Revolution. Because I heard the term like in political science circles, especially in like left-leaning circles, you hear neo-Luddite a lot. Like that's a pejorative term. Like neo-Luddite means
in left-leaning circles.
yeah, like
That's surprising because I think a lot of the backlash against tech comes from the left now. So
it's more like in college I was like a Marxist, you know, like and like you got into really detailed discussions about like socialism and stuff, and like you call it, oh, you're a neo-Luddite, you know, like that's
you were a Marxist in college?
like for a semester.
Okay, a pro-technology Marxist.
I mean, I guess.
All right, cool. All right.
But anyway, my perception of them changed a lot. I mean, like I noticed in a way they are the same as all like humanist, like freedom-loving groups. Like the connection to Lord of the Rings was particularly striking. Like if you go back and actually watch the scenes from the Shire and Bilbo's talking about the Shire, like that's all Luddite stuff. That's all like we lost a past and we're trying to regain it. You know, it's the parallels are like very striking.
Yeah, they lean into that in the Two Towers as well. Like if you go to like Isengard, it's all about the machines kind of tearing down trees and stuff. Yeah, I'd never thought of the Luddites watching it.
Even like Avatar, like you did the James Cameron one, or like Fern Gully, like all those movies about a lost Dances with Wolves, like the reaction against industrialism and the machine and like the humanistic aspect, like that has been a steady theme. That's what's most surprising to me.
Yeah, I guess the main glaring difference here seems like that the Luddites were like from within the society doing it, whereas like a lot of the other ones were it was kind of forced by an outside force. But yeah, okay. And then actually like related to that, is there like other than so we have this word like Luddite that is entered in like colloquial usage in English just to mean someone anti-technology. Was that the main reason that you chose to focus on this? You were just kind of investigating that thread? Because I would imagine there are probably a lot of other backlash kind of insurgency events that happened throughout the Industrial Revolution that you could have chosen. Were there kind of reasons other than the stickiness of the term that this makes for a good example?
I just had an instinct this would be a good presentation. That's all. It could have turned out it could have turned out badly too.
Okay, all right. That's an honest answer. Cheers. Cool. All right. So okay, let's talk a little bit about like differences between the back then and now. Obviously, a lot has changed, and I think one of the things that's really changed is mobility. Like right now, it's quite easy for people to kind of move location, which move to an area with a better job opportunity. Whereas like back then, railroads were like, from what I understand, just starting to be built, and so it took you a long time to travel anywhere. Do you see that as being like a big difference in like how might that affect things?
I don't think so, because I don't think mobility, it's greater than it was in the past, of course, with technology, but at the same time, I think people who don't have money can't really move that well at any time. And I think we see that in like movements of natural disasters and like or the lack thereof. Although I guess into your point, the migration of people that we've seen like from like the Middle East to like Europe, or from Latin America to like America. Like people can move, they really need to. So, but I suppose in the Luddite time, there was that too. So I'm not really sure. Yeah.
Okay, all right, fair enough. One thing that really stuck out to me was it was a claim you made about this, like the Luddite rebellion and then the backlash by the government. I think you described it as like the first alignment of like state and capital. I'm guessing you mean something like a bit more specific than just that sentence, since like that like it would be easy to think of like historical examples. I think a lot of times like landowning class were quite tightly interwound with the government. You know, like I know this is definitely true in the Roman times, and like there were kind of mercantilist states before. So could you elaborate a bit on that?
So I think in the Luddite time, this was the beginning of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. In feudalism, you had a king, and you had the king supported by the land-owning class, the feudal lords, which basically had serfs, and they like owned those serfs. And back then, you did things based on honor. You didn't really do things based on money. Like merchants were kind of shunned. And with the introduction of these technologies that allowed production to go much higher, like the merchant class gained in power and gained in like money and productivity. And this was the first time, I think, the feudal lords and the kind of the what do you call it, the government, I guess the kingly government,
The state, yeah, sure.
the state. This was the first example of them like deliberately aligning, because like the factories need to keep open so that we can keep supplying our troops and whoever else in the colonies with these textiles and keep the money rolling to keep the empire flowing. And it was like a practical alignment of interests, but it kind of set the stage for like this merger of like capital and power, which is before capital was on the outskirts of power.
Okay, so like I guess the way I'm imagining this is almost like it's like, okay, in feudalism you have kind of like the monarchy, the king, and then you have the sort of landowning nobility, and then you have the merchant class beneath them, and then you have kind of most of the population. And before there was kind of like a lot more, I guess, like kind of conflict of power between the landowning class and the monarchy, and the merchant class were just like firmly below them, whereas this was a transition towards like kind of the merging of those three into one kind of one unit. Is that one way to look at it?
That's my understanding. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's a super Marxist perspective. Now that I say it out loud. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Fair enough. Yeah. Right. One thing you mentioned also was the reaching of some new equilibrium after this.
Right.
So I'm going to ask you to take out your crystal ball here. How long do you imagine that taking? Like, I mean, I guess there's a couple ways to think of this, because with the, you could argue that the Luddite rebellion is just like still happening, and like the industrial revolution like hasn't settled into anything, but like along certain dimensions there were some like kind of equilibria reached. Do you have any ideas of like if there is we're starting to see the beginnings of this backlash against AI? Like, how long do you think that takes to settle out?
I think if we were to be compared to the Luddite period, like, remember the Luddite rebellion started 1811, and it is more in the 20-year period between like 1790 to that time when they started seeing all these factories pop up and people started losing their jobs, and like they really started seeing change, and discontent was building and building and building. Like, I think we are in the discontent building period. I don't think we will know where it's going to go until it has really boiled. Until I would say, okay, if there's a couple of things that I would look for is like, if the predictions of the entry of robots into the workforce, like in the Amazon case or whatever, like huge amounts, like 500,000 or something like that. When we see that, if we see the continuing job lot, like the difficulties that new grads have for looking for jobs, and like kind of the job numbers, like if this keeps going at this rate, and I think in a couple more years when you see like, I'm not really sure there has been a change in like the amount of people that are destitute. I know homelessness is an issue, and there's been more of a problem.
Yeah, but that was an issue before. Yeah, it was having a meaningful impact on the economy.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, that had been growing for a bit, I think.
I think when you start seeing like real material changes, like real desperation amongst large swaths of the population, I think you will see a lot of things change if that happens at all, and like a lot of. Okay, So to answer your question directly, I think like there will have to be some kind of the difference between Luddites and us is like I think back in those days, for some reason, the government, the state didn't think it was their business to support the merchants that were put out by work, versus now I think that there's more of an argument for the state to support people that are like their jobs are automated away by AI or something like that. I think there's more of a culture like that now. And also like back then their state, it was a monarchy. It was not really responsive to the people. I think our governments are a little more responsive to the ideas of the people. So I think there's a more flex in our political system, hopefully, maybe. I'm not really sure, but I think I don't know, the discussion over like UBI or taxing tech companies or something like that, like some combination of that, will be one aspect of a new normal.
Okay, so I guess I'm just trying to think of how to paraphrase that. Like, okay, well, one, we're just getting started. Like, you know, the 2 hunger strikes were probably not peak AI protest. And yeah, a bit harder to see beyond there. But also, like, yeah, one of the things that's encouraging in our favor is that governments now seem to be a bit more aligned with people's interests than the government was at the time of the Luddites. Is that a fair summary?
I mean, I know a lot of people that would disagree to say the government would be aligned with people.
Well, yeah. I think it's important to note that like there's a difference between claiming that governments are generally aligned with people now versus like in a relative sense. I think it's someone would have a hard time making the case that no, actually in the early 1800s, like the British government was just like all about human rights for their people. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say in no small part thanks to the Luddites and like the development of trade unionism and like just like human rights standards over the last like 200 years, we benefit from a better relationship with the government that are more responsive in democratic countries. Yes.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. All right. On the same page there. Let's talk numbers a bit more. You mentioned I think it was 14,000 like troops deployed.
Yeah.
But like against how many? Like I mean, maybe this is a hard question to answer since like often insurgencies have like difficult to estimate numbers. But could you get like did you come across any firmer numbers on how many Luddites there were or like percentage of kind of workers or population?
When I was reading the book, like it's in my notes somewhere, but I don't really like from what I'm read. I'm gonna guess like a couple of thousand.
Okay,
it wasn't that much.
Yeah, and that would be like active kind of like kind of people that really identify with the movement and were doing this.
Yeah.
But then I guess you also mentioned that there was a lot of the they had a lot of like kind of passive support from the general population. So
well, yes, I mean they had I mean. In classic insurgency fashion, I think they had a lot of support from the population, which were terrified of saying anything, or like they didn't want to say anything because they supported them, or they were terrified. It was a combination of intimidating the people that don't support you, and like benefiting the people that do support you. But I think that like the reason the numbers you'll never know because, like with this Ned Ludd, this figure King Ludd, like it was almost like. I think back on how maybe like 10 years ago when ISIS was a thing, everyone was using ISIS as not to put them in the same light, but you name a banner head and you seem larger than you are. So I think like no one knew how many numbers they were. But like from what I'm reading, most of the raids and actions that occurred, like it's mostly like 20 guys. It's like it wasn't that many people. I think the most amount of people on the streets were during those food riots. And then I think it was just people taking the banner head of that and just saying that they were,
Yeah, I guess it's always tough to like kind of get really, really firm on numbers for these types of things because like for the 14,000 like military troops, like you can get a pretty clean number for that if you're the government because you're deploying X number of battalions or whatever. But for the people involved in the Luddite things, someone could have been sympathetic for a few weeks and then got involved and do a thing. Someone else might have like not been involved but sort of like deliberately let them hide in their home for a bit. So I think there's a lot more. I guess there's a lot more of a gray area. So yeah, inherently difficult.
For sure.
Right. Did you okay, you kind of mentioned at the end like this leaves me wanting like a bit more of a conclusion in terms of what were practical takeaways? Like reading this and coming out of it, were there any things that you thought like, oh man, like it'd be great if like the Pause AI people study this because then they would know, to try X, or like, it'd be good if like government, entities like, study this because then they could learn to avoid doing Y. Like, do you have any advice for any of the players as a result of this?
That's a tough question. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to give a very unsatisfying answer, and I'm going to say, in terms of direct action, no, I wouldn't have no real advice other than to understand that, like, the I think my main takeaway from this personally is the overall movement of history and how the forces of one century affect the next, and that sets into motion like the system of the next. Like my main takeaway is that, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this talk was that I do believe that we are at the crossroads with AI into moving us into a new political economic system beyond capitalism, which is what I'm quoting Marx a lot. I'm not a Marxist, but I'm quoting Marx a lot. But Marx did write about like late stage capitalism and how technology would ultimately lead its unraveling, because like it's always dependent on increased means of production, which requires less labor. But at the same time, you need people to have money to buy your stuff. So like, if it's all about growth and like, where are you going to get all this money from if only like the machines are employed, you know? So like, essentially, I would say the stuff that he wrote about late stage capitalism is coming to fruition. The next system we are going to, I'm not sure what it is. It may not be something that we have already thought of in the 20th century. So I would say that it is, in terms of, I would say just like in approaching where we are right now, in terms of people working on AI safety, I would say look at it in like a very broad historical, political, economic, philosophical context. Like there's so many threads in it. I guess that's the one thing that I would take away from all this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, predictions and this stuff are inherently difficult just because there's so many different systems interacting with each other. That's fair enough. Okay, in terms of more, like, I guess practical actions people take, but you are not recommending. No. You mentioned easy targets. So you talked about like, back then there were kind of the actual, mills owned by the merchants, or the kind of the capital class, and like kind of they went in and were actually smashing the physical machines. Whereas I was pretty surprised that you listed like Devon and like data centers as comparable easy targets, because I don't really think of them as easy targets. Like Devon is a digital tool, right?
Yes.
And a data center is a physical thing, but like they're generally pretty remotely located. And I would imagine that it would be hard for a small number of people to do a lot of damage before the authorities show up. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think I don't know if there's been any data center protests yet, but I am assuming that day will come, especially if the data center rollout goes out as planned, and it's going to challenge the energy grid. Like a couple days ago, I saw an article about like Alberta says they're out of electricity already. We can't have any more electricity. So I already see this conflict happening, and if this conflict continues down this road, there will be, if not physical protests, I mean, I think there will be physical protests too. In terms of Devon, the reason why I bring that up is just because, like, I saw this one article where when people in this company thought like the AI Devon engineer was like a real person, they were like, "Oh yeah, he's okay." But when it was revealed that it was an AI, the vitriol that came out against this.
Oh, okay, so you're talking more in terms of symbolic targets rather than physical ones. Like I mean, the data center is now like. Becoming like a symbol of like power consumption and water usage, regardless of how accurate those
could be
numbers
physical
are.
too.
Like, okay,
could be physical.
Yeah,
down the line.
Yeah, to date, most of the protests have been in front of the offices, which I guess probably more convenient to get to, anyways, for the protesters.
Like if people are living in these regions, like I don't know, I think you can draw a parallel to like mining companies and how they affect communities, or like I don't know, any companies that have an environmental impact, and like I think you can draw a similar linkage to.
There are parallels, yeah.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay, one thing you also touched on was war as like an important backdrop for a lot of this stuff. Like you kind of mentioned how insurgencies tend to happen during wartime. Could you talk a little bit more about how we might see things differently if there is or is not wartime? Because like I guess the stressors that kind of cause the Luddite insurgency, like part of it was like material shortages from the war, but like part of it was also just a thing that would have been there if there wasn't a war, and that the the new technology was coming along. Like, so I guess I'm curious to hear you talk about like how would you have seen things playing out in Britain with kind of the kind of mass automation thing if they hadn't been at war with France, and then like let's say we managed to avoid warfare in the coming decades, but AI still is like a massive impact on the economy. Like, how do you see that playing out as opposed to a wartime situation?
That's a very tough question. I think you can be you can devote more resources to solving an internal problem if you're not at war. And if you're at war, it kind of splits your thinking, because on the one hand, you have to deal with your internal problem, and the other, you have to be strong in the external. You have to do what you need to do on the international stage. However, the people inside that are seeing your like the ones that are causing your internal problem, may not see it like that. You might be the whole problem for them. So, like, for instance, like I think the war in, like, for instance, World War I in Russia, the war is what was a big boon for the like Bolsheviks, who basically argued to the people, like, look at this war that's like impoverishing all of us. We have to have going like, we have food shortages. It's because these upper classes, the war of these upper classes with each other, they're not on us. We were aligned with the lower classes of England and of wherever. So war is like a counterpart to these kind of like, it's an opportunity for these kind of insurgencies. Anyways, to answer your question directly, like what would, if we avoided a war, how would AI roll out? I think honestly that'd be the ideal scenario. We would deal with these AI issues without any war. That's kind of the ideal scenario, and we have a better chance to solve them, especially for international cooperation too.
Yeah, I hope we can all agree on that one. Yeah.
But I think with the structures that are being set today, especially with regards to like my previous talk on the frontier AI in the U.S. military, the overall structures that are set up, war will exacerbate these things, or like will the systems that are set up now will be deepened, and because it's stress on the system.
Yeah, and I guess like hungry people tend to go to more extreme measures.
Yes.
If your belly is full and like your family is safe, whereas if you feel that's not the case, then you're more likely to take drastic actions. And then and also, as you said, if a country is not at war, there's more resources one can use to kind of solve issues in a more, I guess, like amicable way. Yeah, fair enough. And did you come across any? You mentioned that like they saw themselves a little bit more like Robin Hood. Did they actually make that explicit comparison? Because I got kind of excited when I saw your map. It actually had Nottingham on there. Like, just curiosity question.
Yeah, actually, the first Luddites were from Nottinghamshire, and they actually had poems being like, I'm not going to recite Old English, but it was basically.
I'd like you to recite the poem right now, Jason.
They're basically like, I don't want to hear about no Robin Hood. I want to hear about the Luddites. Like, that was a poem from the Luddites.
It was like a rap battle.
Basically.
All right, cool.
Paraphrasing here.
All right.
Paraphrasing.
Next Wednesday, Jason's actually going to recite several raps he wrote about the Luddites. Yeah, no. Cool. Well, let's end it there. Thanks so much, Jason.
Thank you.
Again, thanks so much for attending. Everyone's welcome to hang out until we kick you out, but that usually doesn't happen for at least a couple of hours. Georgia's trying to say something. Just yell. What's that? Hackathon. That's right. There's a hackathon this weekend. This weekend, there is a defensive acceleration hackathon. That's defense in the more general sense, not in the military sense. A couple of people got confused by that recently, so we're not. Yeah. So for those who don't know, defensive acceleration is this concept of deliberately trying to build technology that is defensive in nature. That is things like, vaccines are a defensive technology against like bioweapons or natural pandemics. Actually last week we had a talk on like using AI agents to kind of find bugs in cybersecurity vulnerabilities and patch them in time. That would be like defensive against cyber attacks, that kind of thing. So there is going to be a hackathon here this weekend. If you were interested in that, there are various posters. You look for the words AI Safety Hackathon, or just come talk to myself or Georgia. Georgia, wave. All right. That's Georgia at the back. And thanks so much for coming. Feel free to hang out.